Everyone, thank you so much for coming to our session. I am Jennifer Van Allen. I'm an associate professor of literacy education at Lehman College, which is part of the CUNY City University of New York system.
And I'm Stacy Katz. I'm an open resources librarian, also at Lehman College. And so thank you for being here. For those of you who are online, I'm also going to be trying to attempt to monitor the chat so that we can be in multiple places at one time, but it's also breaking my brain a little bit. So bear with me if I'm a little distracted in that way. So just to give an overview of the session, we're going to talk about some common definitions of open educational practices, the TPAC model, and then have some time for discussion. So we've been in a bunch of sessions where we haven't really had that kind of space to unpack, so we're really intentionally leaving time for that. So also, if you are someone who either in person or online is like, I don't really feel like talking to anyone, just know that this is something that's coming down the pipe for us. So just to start off, we're positioning this within open education. Obviously, that's a conference we're at, and the belief that learning materials and experiences should be available to everyone. It goes beyond access, constructing an open education ecosystem where individuals can develop and teach with learning materials, and also where students are positioned as knowledge co-creators. So really, we're talking about open as the umbrella term, not just OER, not open pedagogy. We're really looking at open educational practices overall. So we're going to talk about some of these frameworks and attributes of open pedagogy, social justice, and implications of open educational practices.
How many of you are familiar with the TPAC framework? Oh, okay, so not as many. All right, we'll dig in a little bit more deeply then. But what we found is that there are a lot of frameworks that discuss the continuum of openness, attributes of open pedagogy, and social justice implications. But there's none that really explain the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that you need to engage in these practices. And that's where we started to marry the TPAC model, which is the technological, pedagogical, content knowledge model or framework, which is widely used in education, but clearly not talked about in open education. So we are in this presentation, we're hoping to conceptualize and provide examples of what OEP looks like within the TPAC framework in order to make those connections by really considering technology, pedagogy, and technology. It shows it will enhance equity and intentionality and care in this process as we work with students. Oh, and I should say, you can, if you follow that QR code or type in tinyurl.com/TPAC-OEP, it will take you to a handout that kind of summarizes everything all together, and that we'll be using to guide our discussion.
So when we're talking about open educational practices, we just want to be really clear that we're talking about sort of a process-centered approach, not just content-centered OER, but really what are the equitable teaching and learning practices through openness? And then what are the kind of pieces of this that we need to talk about? So teaching and learning materials and educational opportunities that are created and can grow, be updated for accessibility, cultural relevance, inclusivity, timeliness, and also the process of deconstructing the traditional teacher-student relationships and empowering students to engage in dialogue about concepts, curation of resources, co-creation of content, and that co-constructor of knowledge piece. So most people in the room are probably familiar with this, but we just wanted to put it out there to make sure we're all on the same page. And these are some examples, but by no means like the end-all be-all list of open educational practices that can be discussed.
All right, so let's dig into the TPAC framework just a little bit more. Mishra and Kohler are the designers of this framework, and they argued that simply adding technology into our teaching is not enough because specific knowledge is required in order to really meaningfully integrate technology into these processes. So we first need to consider our content and be disciplinary experts, and then merge our content with instructional methods that really facilitate learning of that content, and then consider, does technology help me with this process? Will it enhance the learning process? Because in some cases, it can actually detract from the processes. So there are three interrelated bases of knowledge in the TPACK framework. The first is content knowledge, and that's that disciplinary expertise in the subject matter that one's teaching, like facts, concepts, theories, procedures, how all of these ideas are connected together, and the evidence that supports that disciplinary knowledge. So that's how we define content knowledge. Pedagogical knowledge refers to a deep understanding of how individuals learn, knowledge of various teaching methods and practices that can be used in a classroom, and overall aims, purposes, values of education that we have. So that falls into a separate piece. You have to be a content expert, but you also have to have knowledge of pedagogy. And lastly, technological knowledge, which is knowledge of and about various tools, devices, software, applications. What's really interesting is when Mishra and Kohler posed this model, they define technological tools as any tool that you use in your teaching, which could include traditional pencil and paper. It could include technology, right? So it's really any resource that you use in your instruction. Whiteboards, smart boards. However, when we start to integrate more of these modern technologies, such as AI, they are going to change and morph and grow. And so the knowledge that we need and that we need to prepare our students with to interact with these technologies is going to change over time. And so that flexibility is required. So that technological knowledge is knowledge of those tools and resources, but also knowledge about how to use them and apply them and adapt them in an ever-changing technological landscape. So when we look at the interactions, you see like the Venn diagram model, we see the overlapping interconnections. And that's based on the belief that technology integration efforts should be creatively designed and structured for particular subject matter and ideas. For example, an instructor who's using a chemistry lab to lecture from PowerPoints, but it's laden with bullet points of the content, they demonstrate exemplary content knowledge, but they're not really maximizing their classroom time pedagogically for the hands-on learning, since it's all delivered by lecture, or making use of interactive visuals that are afforded to us by technology tools these days. From this perspective, we can see that educators really have to interweave all of their knowledge together to design really meaningful learning experiences that flexibly matches their content area and their contents. That's going to be different in every classroom, in every school, right? Because all of our contexts are different. So it's at the intersection of technological, pedagogical content knowledge that we have to make these key decisions for our students in our classrooms, and knowing when and how to use technology in constructive ways.
So these are how we see the intersections of open educational practices and the TPACK framework, because there are layered complexities in considering how and the extent to which OER, which we see as the content knowledge, open pedagogy, the pedagogical knowledge, and the digital tools used in these practices, the technological knowledge, can increase access, foster inclusivity, enhance learning, develop capacity and agency, and empower learners when designing curriculum and instruction. So to engage in OEP, educators don't have to just know about the knowledge, skills, and disciplines related to their discipline itself, but also related to open education, Creative Commons licensing, open pedagogy, the digital tools that facilitate OEP, how to actually choose among the tools that they have access to, and then the intentionality and care in negotiating with openness with students. So when OEP is layered onto the TPACK framework, educators become more aware of the content, pedagogy, and technology knowledge needed to relate these open practices, and can consider aspects related to the design to make more socially just learning environments when it's intentionally made.
So we're saying you have to have the content knowledge, the discipline specific, but also additional knowledge of open education. So what does that look like? Well, content knowledge. If we layer with open education, we're thinking specifically about open education and open practices. You need to have knowledge of the 5 R's, CC licensing, and the symbols, what they mean, what you're giving permission for your users to do with your content. when you're adapting or remixing. Attribution practices, balancing privacy and openness, and Cronin has that model of the macro, meso, micro, and nano levels of balancing openness and privacy. And so that's really important to consider. Sometimes we need to teach this directly to our students. Sometimes we don't have to maybe address it because we're engaging in open pedagogy that is more closed off and not something that they're going to share with the world. So we really need to consider all of these things. We have to have knowledge of that as instructors, but we also have to teach our students that, which we often don't think about, right? Pedagogical knowledge is awareness of and skill in implementing various instructional practices associated with open pedagogy, like selecting lessons and materials to meet needs, or selecting activities and assessments that will meet our intended learning outcomes, like when should we use social annotation versus actually just engage them in discussion in a room or in a chat, right? So making some of those decisions. When we merge them together, pedagogical content knowledge is being able to flexibly apply OEP methods for engaging students. A history example, history instructors can use social annotation to compare and contrast to accounts of an event. Math instructors may use blogging to help students learn to communicate mathematical ideas by having them blog the steps they took to solve a problem. Or we might invite students to share their work in open repositories and guide students to select CC licenses and choices of who to share work as and with, while providing assignment alternatives for those who don't want to share openly.
So then the other knowledge domain is the technological knowledge, which is the knowledge about and skill with the digital resources most appropriate for sharing and producing open educational practices and resources. So faculty need to explore resources to become familiar with them and simultaneously develop their own digital literacy skills in using them to teach with the resources. They don't necessarily need, in-depth knowledge and skill, but familiarity and the starting point for imagining the pedagogical use. They need to know the accessibility of a resource or making it usable by everyone. Then there's also technological content knowledge. These are kind of the intersections of this Venn diagram, which is where it's kind of the interesting pieces are, because they're sort of in tension with each other, where one changes and that changes the other needs. So awareness of general repositories and tools, as well as discipline-specific ones like the National Science Digital Library, which provides access to OER in STEM disciplines for educators to use with students at all levels. Then there's also technological pedagogical knowledge, which is the other, the yellow-pinkish Venn diagram there, to intentionally scaffold learning experiences to prepare students to use the digital tools. So if someone wants to use Hypothesis, let's say, to engage in public social annotation through a course, students need to first know how to install something in their Chrome browser and use the Hypothesis extension, sign up for an account. And then a faculty member has to model how to create annotations and replies to others using the guidelines for expectations. As someone who works with faculty to do this, sometimes faculty, I feel like, get hung up with OER on that technological piece often. Which platform do I choose? It feels like sometimes the driving decision, which one am I going to use? But there's all these pieces that play into it, where that's where we're trying to show these three interconnecting pieces as people who talk to other folks about OEP, as people who plan trainings for faculty, that these are the pieces we need to be thinking about to be intentionally designing. And there's a complexity to it that we need to understand and also relate to faculty, that open is more than just either the 5 R's, and it's more than the platform you choose, it's the pedagogical experience that you're designing.
So at the intersection of all three, right there in the middle, the green of our Venn diagram, is the technological pedagogical content knowledge, which is understanding the complex ways open is embedded in all of these pieces and intentionally designing learning environments and instruction. So when we're considering renewable assignments that demonstrate the learning objectives of the course, we also want to consider what's going to be a good contribution to the discipline, to the community, to the public public knowledge commons, and what specific tools and how are we going to scaffold that support? So are we going to do some peer review so students feel more confident about their work before they're putting it out in the open? How are we going to scaffold that learning experience? How are we going to help them make CC licensing decisions, since they can be complex and nuanced? So with that, what we want to do is give you time to discuss. And so here's the handout again with this model on it. And it also has a whole list of OEP practices with some ideas, defining it, and educational tools that you might use with it. You can use that as a starting point for your discussion, or you can use any open practice that you're aware of. What we want you to is talk for about the next 7 minutes to analyze and discuss the specific examples of OEP through this framework. So pick one and think about what are the knowledge demands that are required of students. You might consider digital literacies, knowledge of open practices, knowledge of OER. What decisions would an instructor need to make regarding the content, pedagogy, or technology? And what decisions do instructors need to guide students to negotiate openness and privacy using this as the framework? So we're going to give you about 5 to 7 minutes to talk. Those of you online can talk in the chat, and those of you in the room, find a partner and talk with a partner about these questions, and then we'll come back together. together. Looks like we're having some really great discussion. But I'd also like to hear, what were some of the key things that you're thinking about as you layer open education on top of this TPAC framework? What were some of the thoughts that you guys had with specific open practices, what you discussed?
I'm gonna have a night quick.
Okay, so we got a little distracted.
That's okay, in a great way. In a great way, I like it.
And one of the things that we really talked about is the value of bringing an instructional designer into the conversations, because that person, that instructional designer, in collaboration with the librarian and the faculty subject matter expert, can really address, I think, this TPAC model in a little bit different way, because they're all bringing that expertise to the table. So it's not all on the faculty member, for example, to suddenly trying to build their activities or their course or their assignment and bring in this amazing model, which is an excellent model.
Yes, it's almost like you've got the instructor as the content knowledge expert, the instructional designer as the pedagogical expert, and the librarian as the open education expert. And so we're all coming together to figure it out. That's great.
We were also chatting about how this is a nice way to kind of reframe technology skills around away from unpreparedness and into like learning something new. That we're talking about how like a lot of our students don't understand things like file structures because they didn't grow up with machines that needed to use folders and things like that. It's not familiar for them. They don't know keyboard shortcuts. They don't know all this kind of stuff. But this way, if you're scaffolding the content knowledge and the pedagogical knowledge with the technical knowledge, it's kind of evening that and saying this is important to know too. And not shaming them for not knowing how to use the same kind of computer that their much older faculty member naturally knows how to do.
Rather than it being an afterthought or something you're throwing in because you see your student struggling with something, you're actually planning it in. You're being very, very intentional. Yeah, and I think that's what this does. There's so many decisions you have to make as an instructor as you're designing. So this helps bring awareness of all of the parts and pieces, right?
Stacy, I don't know if maybe there was one question from the chat you might want to raise or a comment.
I mean, we're having a really lively chat. Sorry, I got a little distracted by it. Yeah, there's been a lot about building in TPAC partnerships that we can have among librarians, instructional designers, and faculty to have these conversations. The privacy piece of intentionally negotiating that when we're talking about open, which again, like Catherine Cronin's work is really seminal on this, of like, you know, certain disciplinary fields like in social work, when you're talking about patient confidentiality and things like that, that you want to really focus on and emphasize. So yeah, there's great stuff happening in the chat too, so.
We have 20 minutes. I don't know if you want to try to bring this to the close.
Yes, so if you would like to learn more, we wrote a whole article on this with lots of different content examples. It's called Viewing Open Education Within the TPAC Framework. And you can find it in the research in learning technology. It's at the bottom of the handout as well. And it's linked on our presentation slides. And all of this is in SCED as well. So take a look.